Good morning, everyone. A bright Tuesday morning, a little brisk here in Chicago. We're getting a taste of fall. Um, I'm Rachel Lieberman. I am a director here at the Celiac Disease Center. We want to welcome you to our Family Network program today on manufacturing facilities, labels, and disclaimer confirmation. Before I introduce our amazing guest speaker, I want to go over a few housekeeping rules. We will be recording today's session. I do ask that you stay on mute and utilize your chat, the chat function. We will have a lot of time for a Q&A with Dr. Laura Allred after she presents. So I just want to encourage you, please use the chat for your questions. And want you know that I am bouncing with interference, I hope. Do you hear that, Lindsay, or no?
I think I just fixed it. Somebody wasn't muted.
Okay. So, without further ado, I am incredibly excited to have Dr. Laura Allred with us today. She is the regulatory manager for the GFCO certification program since 2015, and her doctoral work was in immunology, specializing in autoimmune diseases. And before her work at GFCO, Dr. Allred ran a private laboratory that performed gluten and allergen analysis and developed gluten test kits. So we could not be more excited to learn. As we like to say, knowledge is power. And I'm really looking forward to a fantastic chat in the Q&A. I apologize. It's the Q&A function. Not the chat is there as well, but we would love for you to utilize the Q&A function for questions. We will be sure to address them. And I also just want to note that aside from Lindsay, who is our amazing educational coordinator here with us, we have Dr. Ritu Verma, as well as Dr. Audrey Rowan, and Dr. Verma is our medical director and chief of our pediatric gastroenterology department here at Comer Children's at University of Chicago, and Audrey is our dietitian with the center. So we're so happy they are also on. And so I want to welcome this amazing team, but we are so excited, Dr. Allred, for you to get started. So thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Lindsay, and thanks to the Family Network for inviting me here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so I can get my presentation going. Okay. Thank you all for coming. Today we're going to talk a little about gluten-free manufacturing and product labeling, talking about what happens in the manufacturing plant, what companies do when they decide they're going to make gluten-free products, and then sort of change gears, talk about product labeling. As Rachel mentioned, I'm with GFCO, which is a gluten-free product certifier, and we're a program of the gluten intolerance group. The gluten intolerance group started as a little support group back in 1974, basically trying to help people find safe gluten-free products. Back in 1974, there wasn't any gluten-free labeling. There was no certification. So people got together to kind of help each other figure out what they could eat safely. We're coming up on our 50th anniversary next month, or next year, I mean. And then as part of that mission to help people find safe gluten-free foods, the Gluten Intolerance Group started the GFCO program in 2005. And as of now, we certify products for about 1,700 companies, about 2,000 brands, about 60,000 or more products overall. So you guys have probably seen our little mark on things out there in the market. So what we wanted to start off talking about today is gluten control. Like I said, we're going to talk about if you're a manufacturer, you're a new manufacturer, existing manufacturer, and you say, I'm going to make a gluten-free product, how do you do that? How do you make sure you're going to make a safe product? And the steps in that I've sort of listed out here are, first you have to do a risk assessment and figure out where in your plant potential gluten risks are coming from. And then you have to find out ways to make sure those risks don't pose a problem. You have to mitigate those risks. Then you generally write up policies and procedures to make sure that those mitigation strategies stay in place. There's a lot of turnover in food manufacturing, so having really good policies and procedures is really important. You then want to train everybody working in your facility, and also hopefully the people who talk to the public, so that they understand what you're doing to make safe products. And then it's a bit of a circular process in that you go back then and monitor and make sure that your mitigation strategies are working, and see if you have any changes you've got to make. So when a company starts off doing a risk assessment, they generally do it, kind of from the receiving door out the other end where they distribute product. And the way they're going to do that risk assessment depends a little bit on the kind of operation that they have. First big consideration, are you running a dedicated gluten-free facility versus one that's not dedicated to gluten-free that might be handling wheat, rye, or barley? We call these shared facilities, but that sharing can happen in a lot of different ways, and all of that's going to affect your risk assessment. So you may have, for instance, the picture here of a manufacturing facility with two lines next to each other. You may be operating gluten-containing material on one of these lines and gluten-free on the other. That certainly would make this a shared facility. But then this room may actually be completely separated from where you're making gluten-containing products, and maybe this section is entirely gluten-free. And there's also manufacturers who operate basically campuses. They'll have multiple large warehouse-style buildings where they're doing their manufacturing. Some of those different buildings may work with gluten-containing materials. Some of them may be dedicated to gluten-free. So there's a lot of different ways in which dedicated or non-dedicated can play out. And it's important that people consider those when they're doing the risk assessment. Now, if you're sharing facilities, there's also a chance that you're sharing equipment. And, again, looking at this picture, like I said, you may have lines next to each other, one doing gluten-containing, one doing gluten-free, but you may actually be doing gluten-containing product and gluten-free product on the same manufacturing line. That also brings in a whole host of new risks that you have to assess and try to find a way to mitigate. And in both cases, whether you're doing dedicated gluten-free production or non-dedicated production, really your biggest source of risk typically is your incoming materials, anything that you're bringing into the plant, primarily your ingredients, but also anything that comes in the door at your facility. So like I said, when people are doing a risk analysis, they usually start at that receiving door or the inputs, kind of work their way through looking at all the risks until you get to the product that's going out of your warehouse. So starting with incoming materials and doing a risk assessment and figuring out how to mitigate that. There's a lot of different inputs when you're making food, and particularly when making gluten-free food, that you have to look at to make sure you're making something safe. So for instance, upper picture there, you might be bringing in whole grains. You might be doing grain trucks that are coming in. Or you might just be receiving pre-boxed materials coming in cargo vans. In both cases, you've got to make sure that those transports coming in are clean. For boxed materials, you may just be inspecting the inside of that truck. You may be looking at the packaging, the package wrap, making sure it's all clean before that comes into your facility. You're also making sure that what you ordered is actually what you got. So if you ordered a gluten-free cornstarch, for instance, you want to make sure you actually got the labeled gluten-free cornstarch and not just their generic cornstarch, which may or may not be gluten-free. So there's a lot of to set up around incoming materials. If you do have something like grain trucks that come in, I know I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to a major oat processor, and they have all of their, risk mitigation strategies in place. They've got grower controls. They're not really worried about the actual oats themselves. They've got all of their internal process controls in place. They don't worry really much about what's happening in their own plant. But they expressed to me that their biggest issue they're having is with the trucks coming in, not being cleaned sufficiently. So there's only so many grain trucks to go around the United States. They do sometimes get reused. Now, this company I was speaking with is large enough that they actually own all their own trucks. They own all their own train cars. So they have more control than most people would. But even then, they were having some issues with getting, wheat material that may have been in a truck cleaned out before that truck was used again to do oats. So even, they recognize that what's coming in the plant is the biggest concern. And it's not only raw materials that come into your plant, although those are a big part of it. You've also got your staff that come into the plant every day. And there are dedicated facilities that actually have controls put in place about what employees can bring in, down to the point of, you can't bring your gluten-containing ham sandwich in to the building. So controls can go down that far. And then you also, the picture on the right, you need maintenance, you need repairs done sometimes on your equipment. We had an issue last week with a waffle manufacturer. And it was, if you guys get frozen waffles, you've probably seen, sometimes they have little frozen fruit bits that are included in them, blueberries, that kind of thing. This facility had been running a batch of waffles through. Most of the way through the run, the fruit bit dispenser clogged, and they had to call in a repair person to fix that. And then realized that after the time of that person coming in and working on that fruit bit dispenser, their product suddenly was testing out of spec for gluten. Now, we couldn't put a good story together of how that repair person got gluten into the line. It's possible they'd been working on another line and came over. At the beginning, monitoring is a really important part of this, and people do monitor what they're doing. This company actually has very intensive monitoring in that they are videoing all of their production 24 hours a day, and they can go back and review tape on that. So they were able to go back, zoom in, watch the repairman doing his work, and didn't see anything particular going on. It wasn't like he did something intentional, but they were able to find that exact time point of when that contamination occurred by going back and watching that video, really realizing it was tied to that repair person, and then being able to rechannel that product from that point on. So yeah, anything coming into the facility is risky, and you've got to have ways to mitigate those risks, to watch out for those risks, and have good policies in place for your staff, for your repair people, for truck checks, and that kind of thing. So when you get your raw materials then into your facility, things that can cause issues is storage of those materials. So obviously, if you're a dedicated facility, that's a little easier. You're just doing that upfront check to make sure that you received the product you ordered. But there's a lot of places that either share warehousing or, again, are doing shared production. And in those cases, you've got to make sure that you have good procedures in place for storing your raw materials so that there can't be any cross-contact, cross-contamination with gluten. At a minimum, if it's, not a giant warehouse like you see there on the left, if it's something smaller, you always want your gluten-free or allergen-free materials stored above anything else. But if you're lucky and you've got a large amount of space, you do want to, partition out that storage, keep your gluten-free materials away from anything gluten containing. You also need to have some procedures like you see here in the middle. You have a set of basically sacks of grain that are sitting there. Those are very susceptible to damage and leakage. So, in a lot of cases, the floors of your warehouse will be lined out so that your traffic is diverted around those, so people aren't clipping the edge of those pallets and causing grain spills in your warehouse. And then on the right, what there's a picture of there is a grain dump. It's basically underground storage. They're called a grain pit sometimes. It's underground storage when you receive bulk grains out of a grain truck. And sometimes those can be shared storage. So the plant may work with, a gluten-containing grain that they have dumped into that. There are usually entrances then from down below, both to get the material out and to let you get in there and clean. So if you have a corn shipment coming in, you need to get somebody in there to clean that out first. So you got to have all your procedures in place to get that storage cleaned and ready for your gluten-free materials to come in. So you've brought your stuff in the door and, you figured out how to store all your raw materials. The next important thing to do then is really map out the flow of your production. And again, more important with a mixed use facility, noting any points where gluten-free production and gluten-containing production might cross. So looking at where your warehouse feeds into your manufacturing plant is important. You don't want to be taking your gluten-free or your gluten-containing materials on a pallet through your gluten-free production area. Within production, you want to make sure that production lines, they may be next to each other, but as best you can, you don't want them to cross. If you're stuck with production lines that may cross each other, you always want your gluten-free line to run over the top and your gluten containing underneath, because you don't want any of that gluten material dropping down into your gluten-free lines. And just generally looking at the flow of how product is moving and also how people are moving. You have staff that typically, if you're going to do both gluten containing and gluten-free, you have staff that are dedicated to one or the other. They may wear different colored cover-ups so that it's clear which section of the plant they should be in. They also shouldn't be crossing to get to the things they need. So if somebody's got to go on break and go into the locker room, they shouldn't be cutting through from the gluten-containing production through gluten-free production to get to those locker rooms for their break. So there's a lot of stuff in plant design to consider before you start up your gluten-free manufacturing. And, we get calls from people who come in and ask us to do consulting on this sort of thing, figure out the best way to set up their plants. And once you've kind of got it laid out to where they're at least not sort of, crossing each other, possibly cross-contaminating things, once you've got all that in place and how much your gluten production impacts your gluten-free production, that'll let you set up things like your cleaning schedule. So, for instance, in your plant design, if you find out you absolutely can't avoid certain conflicts in spacing or in lines crossing over, you may decide, all right, we have to completely clean the plant. We have to do our gluten-free production all in one day, and then do the rest of the week as gluten containing, or however many days of gluten-free you need before you break that entire plant and line down again and do your cleaning and then start over again with gluten-free product. That also feeds into what we call production sequencing. How often are you going to do your gluten-free production? People usually try, because it's typically a smaller part of their business. If it's a mixed use facility, they try to lump that gluten-free production together, so they can get the benefit of doing all that cleaning, all that equipment breakdown, do all their gluten-free production, and then move into gluten containing. So yeah, this review of the plant design is really important up front, and it's got to be done again anytime they make any changes. If you bring in a new piece of equipment, if you change, the types of products you're manufacturing, you got to go back and look at this again and see if there's any new crossover that you need to look out for. And then as you're starting to go out the door with your products, it's really important that you have a great way to track your packaging. And again, this is probably more essential in mixed use facilities, but it's important in all of them. The biggest cause of FDA recalls for allergens and gluten is mislabeling and mispackaging. So it's not that people are intentionally making an unsafe product. It's not usually unintentional cross contact. It's that something's been labeled incorrectly. You'll see here in both of these pictures, probably can't see it so well in the one on the left, but the one on the right with the boxes is showing you basically barcode readers. So if you start packaging gluten-free product, your barcode reader should know what barcode it's looking for on that product and flag it for you if it's not seeing that. There was a recent, this isn't telling stories, this is public information. There was a recent Vans waffle recall, gluten-free Vans waffle recall, and it was that the wrong packaging remained on the line from the gluten-free into their gluten-containing production. So part of that gluten-containing waffle production got packaged in the gluten-free boxes. And this kind of equipment, these kind of barcode readers and things like that, can help to mitigate that risk of labeling things incorrectly. So once a company is done, like I said, all this risk assessment, they've figured out how to mitigate all these risks in their plant. Really important that you write out the policies and procedures. I know we go out and we audit manufacturing facilities, and people go, "Oh, you spend so much time looking at paperwork. That's not what's important." It actually is, because as I mentioned, turnover in food manufacturing is very high. If you don't have good policies and procedures in place to make sure all these risks are addressed, that kind of thing can easily be lost as you move to new people. Once you have those policies and procedures, like I said, very important that you train all of your staff, make sure that they're doing those things, and then monitoring is the next important step. So monitoring is a combination of, making sure you're keeping records. So if every time they make a batch of a product, you're keeping what are known as batch records, and that's documentation that tells you every lot of raw material that was used, which pieces of equipment were used to make that, possibly even which staff were on at that time, which packaging was used for that product. So it's really important you have all those in case there is an incident. You can go back and figure out what happened with it. Companies also then at least once a year do internal audits to make sure they're following their own policies and procedures, also to look for any of those kinds of changes that may make them need to do that risk assessment again. Some of them also have external audits from companies like us. There's, SQF, basic food safety audits that happen, and then some specialized audits like gluten-free. And then also as part of monitoring, people test their products and other items to make sure that they're in spec. For us, with our certification, we put testing requirements on high-risk raw materials. That's basically anything that's grain-based is going to be considered high risk up front. If there is shared equipment, after those breakdowns, when they clean out all that equipment, they're going to do swab testing on that equipment, either looking for protein or gluten to make sure that their cleaning was adequate. And then they'll typically also do some level of finished product testing, again, to make sure that all of their stuff is staying within spec. For us, for our certification, like I said, these companies includes annual audits. We also go out and procure 650 or more retail products that we certify every year and test those. We make our companies submit their quarterly testing to us so we can review that. We also look out for logo violations, and we deal with any consumer complaints about certified product. So that was all the manufacturing side, and we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about product labeling. So we talked a lot about mixed use facilities and the kind of things that they do. And those shared facilities a lot of times result in different kinds of precautionary labeling. So before we talk about the different kinds of precautionary labeling you might see and what that means, a couple things that are important to remember. First is that wheat is considered an allergen, and it's also a gluten source. Those are two different immunologic mechanisms, and because of that, there are different labeling requirements for wheat as an allergen as opposed to wheat as a gluten source. While we have the FDA 20 ppm threshold for gluten and gluten-free labeling, there actually is no threshold for wheat as an allergen, or really for any of the big 8, now big 9 allergens that are out there. There is no threshold level. So manufacturers aren't sure when they can feel safe saying that something is wheat-free. There's a threshold for gluten. They do feel comfortable in knowing when they can say that something is gluten-free. I've been going to a lot of meetings lately talking about thresholds and allergen thresholds, and it feels like they're going to go a little different way with allergen labeling, in that it might be serving size based. So it's going to make it a little, it's not going to be a straight number like we have for gluten. So things are going to be a little harder. I won't go too far into that. And then it's also important to remember that labeling of allergens, including wheat, is required under FALCPA, but labeling of all gluten sources is not. So if someone's pudding contains wheat on a package, it's because wheat is an allergen. It's not because it's a gluten source. Also, rye and barley are not required to be listed by their common names. That's why you can see things that say malt, and you have to think to yourself, is that barley malt? I don't know. They didn't have to list it. There is work underway, and you guys are going to get these slides, so hopefully you'll be able to get these links if you want to get involved in this in any way. There's a bill going through called the Food Labeling Modernization Act that's trying to institute required labeling for wheat, rye, and barley as gluten sources. And we think that would be beneficial. We're really about the only Western country that doesn't have that. Canada, all of Europe, everybody else has to label rye and barley. Just in the US, we don't. So, but where this difference between wheat as an allergen and wheat as a gluten source can lead to is confusion with precautionary allergen labeling. So you'll see things that say may contain wheat, processed on shared equipment with wheat, processed in a shared facility with wheat. It's important to remember that those statements only apply to wheat as an allergen. And again, they're having to put those because the manufacturers have no idea what a safe threshold is for wheat as an allergen. And so it's just important to remember that those statements don't invalidate a gluten-free claim. There are multiple test methods out there that can let anybody pick up a product and say, yes, this meets a gluten-free labeling threshold. Whereas there's nothing that lets people test because there's no threshold. And also because there aren't test methods out there really yet for wheat as an allergen. People tend to use the gluten kits to look for wheat as an allergen, but there are actually other proteins besides gluten that can cause an allergic response from wheat. So there's going to have to be a lot more work to do when a threshold is set for wheat as an allergen. Another thing that's really confusing is that you can see a contains wheat statement on a gluten-free product. And this can happen with wheat materials that have been fractionated to remove protein. So always, just like with allergens, if there's no protein present, there's no allergen. If there's no protein present, there's no gluten. So think of things like wheat starch, if it's made well, wheat glucose, just the sugars from wheat. Those can have a gluten-free claim on them. But because people realize it's confusing, the FDA does insist that it has a statement basically saying that the wheat's been processed to allow the food to meet FDA requirements for a gluten-free claim. So yeah, it is always confusing. Hey, this is gluten-free, says it contains wheat. Look for that extra wording because it doesn't have that. Well, if it doesn't have that, I wouldn't purchase it as gluten-free, but also if it doesn't have that, it's mislabeled. So that is it for me. We'll go into questions. Didn't run too far over there. So
Laura,
yeah, happy to talk with you guys. Whoop. Yes.
so this was amazing and a lot of information, and I feel like we should definitely be getting questions. Please put them in our Q&A function right now. I'd love to invite Dr. Ritu Verma to come on camera, and Lindsay. And we also have Lori Wellstead, one of our dietitians, and Audrey here too, in case, we come up with a robust discussion. But Dr. Verma, after this was a lot of information, I'm just wondering, do you want to kick us off with any questions?
You're putting me on the spot.
I'm totally putting you on the spot.
All right. So I guess, from a very practical standpoint, Dr. Allred, first of all, amazing talk. Good to know that there's a lot of checks and balances out there in terms of the companies and all that, which is reassuring. And at the same time, a little scary. So reassuring and scary that if there are companies that don't have those checks and balances and don't get people to review them, then we're in trouble, which is the scary part, which I think every person who lives with celiac disease goes through that. How does myself as a consumer, how do I know what is happening behind the scenes? That's one question. And then the second is perhaps you can enlighten us a little bit more of when the labeling comes in, product that is manufactured in a company or may contain, or any of those, because those are really the big stressors in life. So 2 questions, and I'm sure that there'll be more questions coming.
Yeah, it can be tough. Obviously, back in the day, people, all they could do to find gluten-free foods was read the ingredient list, and that's not always super clear. So the FDA regulation allowing people to make a gluten-free claim has been really helpful. But the only FDA requirements on that is that that statement be truthful and not misleading. There isn't a lot of active follow-up on that. Not doing any kind of sales pitch, I promise, Lindsay, but really, if you're looking for gluten-free and you want to know that that's being monitored, a third-party certification is really helpful. Because then at least at a minimum, they're testing that at a minimum. Hopefully someone has, because it doesn't have to be just there's other gluten-free certifiers besides us, so that product's been tested at some point, that, the ingredients have been reviewed for that product. So that extra help with certification really can kind of ease your mind in terms of whether you can believe that gluten-free claim. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, with all the
off with that one. So if that certification is not there, then does one say, no, I cannot have this product? Because that's limiting us a lot, right? So that's
no. Yeah, I'm just saying a lot of times, I mean, certainly, you guys have probably tried, most of the gluten-free labeled products out there. If you're finding a product that works for you and it's gluten-free labeled, I mean, always look at minimum for a gluten-free label. I wouldn't rely so much on just ingredient listing. I would believe a gluten-free label. I'm just saying, if you want that extra assurance that you don't have to maybe think twice about whether it's ever been tested, you can look for a certification. But no, yeah, start from that gluten-free claim as a minimum. And then, yeah, as far as the may contain shared equipment, shared facility kind of stuff, yeah, I agree it's confusing. The important part to remember is it's really only talking about wheat as an allergen, because even if it's processed on a shared facility, shared equipment, you can still test and make sure that product meets a gluten-free claim where you can't for wheat as an allergen.
So question from the audience. Do you have to have a product that says certified gluten-free, or can one trust if it just says gluten-free? Because again, I think as we educate patients and families and ourselves, every center does their own sort of thing in terms of, some people will say, if it doesn't say certified and you read the ingredients, you're okay. And some people absolutely have the dogma that it has to say certified gluten-free before you can have the product. And, I think we have to keep in mind the cost. The cost of food suddenly goes up as soon as that certified is up there.
Yep.
So I think that just from an audience standpoint, how would you suggest people educate others, or we do it ourselves as patients?
Yeah, I would certainly not write off products with a gluten-free claim. Like I said, that's sort of the minimum. That's the good starting point, is a gluten-free claim of any kind, not a certification, just a gluten-free claim. Because, you're hoping that that's a voluntary statement. That company then should be taking these appropriate steps to make sure that their product is actually gluten-free. They don't want to get an FDA recall on a gluten-free product. And the FDA, while it doesn't do a lot of monitoring and surveillance, they released a survey they did of gluten-free products. They did a lot of testing of all products labeled gluten-free on the market. Very high success rate. They only picked out a couple things that were over the 20 ppm threshold. So it's just tough for me because we go into all the plants we certify. So I know I can tell you that they're doing the right thing. But it does appear, folks that are labeling gluten-free are also doing a good job. Sort of a proof is in the pudding thing. They aren't having recalls. They aren't making people sick. If it's a product you've always trusted and used, sure, it's good.
Fantastic. Well, Lindsay, I know that you had some pre-questions, and we are definitely filling our chat and Q&A. So do you, one question I see in a few different places is about pots and pans. And, Laura, I would love your take on this as well. Do people need to replace all of their pots and pans? We're going to separate pots and pans from utensils. I feel like those are two separate things. And Lindsay, you can jump in here, but Laura, I'd love to hear your take, and Dr. Verma or Lindsay, if you have anything to add after Laura speaks.
Yeah, I mean, looking at this from a manufacturing point of view, anything that's metal, hard surface, stainless steel can easily be cleaned. You just have to be conscientious about it. You have to do a good job of it. You don't have to buy test kits, but you can, if you want to make sure you've cleaned it well enough, because you may say, oh, I've just gotten diagnosed. Do I have to throw out all my pans? No, clean them really well. If you really feel the need, there's some home test kits. I maybe recommend, just the ones that we approve, but, and you can surface swab those, make sure you clean them, but you don't really have to. If they're, stainless steel, hard surface, cleanable, you just need soap and water. There isn't any special cleaner needed to get gluten off of a surface. I would say you're just fine. I would be a little more worried about plastic utensils, silicone utensils, anything that has a chance of being scratched or has a little more absorbent nature. You might want to swap those out, and then set those aside as the ones used for your gluten-free cooking.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Lindsay.
I was just going to say, I would add wooden surfaces, wooden cutting boards, rolling pins, things like that should probably not be used for gluten-free if they've already been used for gluten containing. They're very porous. Things can get in there and hard to remove.
Yeah.
And something I had learned through another session we had is, for all of us, some of our pots and pans, some are older, especially those nonstick. And if they have a lot of, I think Lori Wellstead, you might have taught me this, if there's like a lot of scratches or grooves, that might be a good thing to replace for sure. But I agree. We've always said soap, water, good washing. Dr. Verma, do you have anything to add to that?
I just say that if you want, as a kitchen, you want us to write a prescription for a new kitchen, we'll do that, but you don't really need it. You do not need to throw out your pots and pans, just like Dr. Allred mentioned and Lindsay mentioned that soap and water. soap and water is one of the best things that you could do.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
Lindsay, I'm going to let you take away some of these other questions, and I know you had some ones before.
Sure. One of the ones that I had before, and I'm also seeing show up here, is people are looking for a little bit more of an understanding on how medications are going through certification process. And I assume by medications, they actually are maybe meaning more like supplements and things like that, which I believe you would be dealing with that as well, Laura. Is it a similar process? Is it a different process?
So it's all the same. Nutritional supplements made, they're generally made from food-based ingredients. They go through the exact same certification process. They would do that same kind of risk assessment, same way to make those safely gluten-free. There is no gluten-free labeling of pharmaceuticals, and doing pharmaceuticals would be a little more difficult. We don't certify any pharmaceuticals, primarily because we don't know that the test kits would work in them. And if you wanted to test them, you would have to then validate for every individual medication whether that would work. So the only guidance that's really gone out on medications is from way back in 2014 from the FDA, where they basically asked medication manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, they told them that they have the ability to put on there, made without gluten containing ingredients, basically made without wheat, rye, and barley. But they're not even opening pharmaceuticals up to a gluten-free claim. In part, they say because the serving size thing doesn't really make it, you're never going to eat a large enough amount of a pharmaceutical, hopefully, to need truly a gluten-free claim. But yeah, we're kind of stuck on pharmaceuticals, and it's really just whether companies will voluntarily put that messaging on about not using any wheat, rye, or barley in their excipients.
So go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say one thing that I've seen a few times, but just Laura, one of your slides actually had this, which was fantastic. But if you could explain the difference between may contain wheat and process in a facility that also processes wheat, labeling, and just, can you go over that difference one more time?
Well, I wish I could say there's a difference. The fact is that precautionary allergen labeling is entirely voluntary, and people can use whatever words they want to use. So in some cases, people have fallen into they see everybody else saying may contain, so they just use may contain. Their lawyers like those words. That's what they end up using. Other companies actually are conscious about, I want to be as transparent as possible for my, end users, for my consumer. And they'll then use some of those wordier statements about, processed on shared facilities, processed on equipment that processed wheat. But at the end of the day, it's all voluntary, and you can't really read too much into the different wordings of those different precautionary statements.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions all related to oats. So what I'd like to do is just kind of have one condensed oat conversation where we just kind of talk through that a little bit. And I'm going to start that just by one of the questions here was, how should somebody feel about oats on a product that aren't specifically called out as gluten-free oats? If it just says oats, is that safe? Should it say gluten-free oats? Does GFCO certify things that don't specifically say gluten-free oats? That topic.
So just from the GFCO part, any raw material used in a certified product has to also meet our 10 ppm threshold. So yes, if there are oats in a certified product, they will be gluten-free oats. But where you get into that semantic difference is people are seeing product from Canada. So if you look at the Canadian gluten-free regulation, it actually says products can't contain wheat, rye, barley, or oats. They went with the Codex definition of gluten, include wheat, rye, barley, and oats. They then came back later and wrote a market authorization that said you can use oats in gluten-free products, but they have to be specially prepared or processed oats. and they have to be labeled as gluten-free oats anywhere they're mentioned on the packaging. So in the ingredient list, anywhere else they're mentioned on the front of the package. That law does not apply in the United States. The FDA doesn't want that extra wording in the ingredient list. So if it's a US made product, it's just going to say oats. If it's Canadian made product and it's gluten-free, it's going to have to say gluten-free oats on it. If the finished product you have is not certified, but it says gluten-free, that finished product should be less than 20 ppm. Can't guarantee what those oats were. So everyone admits there's, always going to be some level of commingling that happens of gluten grains into oats. There are various ways to deal with that. But if someone is making, a granola bar and they're not using very many oats in that, they may not worry so much about how clean those oats are, as long as their finished product is all testing at under 20 ppm. So it's just a little difference in that, because we go that step back and we go, no, all your raw materials also have to meet our threshold. We at least are taking an extra step to make sure those oats were gluten-free before they went into that product, but they won't be labeled as gluten-free oats just because the FDA doesn't want it that way.
Okay, so Canada has a different rule in place with the labeling than the US has. US, it doesn't, even if they're gluten-free oats, purity protocol, whatever, it doesn't have to say that on the ingredient list.
Nope, and they actually don't want it in the
Yeah.
The FDA doesn't like extra words in the ingredient list, so they just want you to put the common or usual name, which is oats.
Okay, all right, that's great. That really clarifies a lot there, I think, for people probably as well. And then just to
follow up on that, so I guess I'm a little confused. So you're saying that in the United States they don't put gluten-free oats on the labels?
You can on the front of your package, but they don't want you to label your oats as gluten-free oats in the ingredient list. So if the only place the oats are mentioned is in the ingredient list, it's just going to say oats. As opposed, like I said, to Canada, where if it's a gluten-free product, the oats have to say gluten-free oats on them.
I guess that actually confuses, because when you look at the products here in the United States, not from Canada, and you look at some products, they actually do say in the ingredients as well, gluten-free oats.
Yeah, they're not supposed to. Some people do it, and that the FDA doesn't crack down on everybody, but yeah, they're really not supposed to, and so a lot of people don't.
So we could see both here.
So if you were to see in the ingredients just saying oats, not gluten-free or not certified gluten-free oats.
Yep. If it just says oats, but the product says gluten-free, then the product itself is gluten-free. You don't know if those oats were, less than 20 before the product was made, but the product is less than 20 ppm.
So you would say that that would be safe if someone has oats in their diet and the product says gluten-free on it.
I don't go down the world of safe. I can tell you that the threshold.
I have to go down that world of as a clinician.
Yeah. So, what I can tell you is that finished product would meet the FDA regulation for gluten-free. As you know, the FDA threshold for gluten-free was not based on a safety assessment. It was based on a testing ability assessment. But they have gone back after the fact and shown that, this type of gluten-free labeling at 20 ppm is not increasing hospitalizations, is not increasing the incidence of celiac disease. So safe is, again, sort of an after the fact measurement of, hey, look, more people aren't getting sick.
Great.
That's interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. The oat topic is always interesting, and I appreciate the thorough explanation, Laura, because it's confusing. It definitely is. So it's helpful. Let's see. If a company says they clean equipment used for gluten-containing products that they're manufacturing before making gluten-free products, does that mean that the products should be safe to eat? If they're stating that they're cleaning. So I'm assuming that this person probably is eating something that they know is on shared equipment, or it's saying that on the packaging. Maybe they've called or emailed and the company has told them that they're going through those good manufacturing practices and cleaning and whatever. Should they feel confident in that?
Yeah, and again, you can always prove it. You can, you can always test that product and prove it, or you can ask the manufacturer to test that product and prove it. Or if it's a certified product, you can ask us. We'll test it and prove it. So people, at least with gluten-free claims, there's always a way to follow up and make sure it's true. But yes, the process of breaking down your equipment, cleaning everything, and then restarting with gluten-free product is very common across the industry, and yeah, generally produces safe product.
Since you mentioned about testing, personal testing at home testing, somebody is asking thoughts on the NEMA tester.
No, no. So this isn't anything personal against the NEMA, but I generally don't recommend it because it hasn't gone through the same type of validation that other kits have. We're actually hopefully before the end of this month, going to put our approved test kit list up on our website so people can see the kits that we have reviewed, the kits that have basically undergone validations through third-party entities, either AOAC or the serial chemists. Both do validation programs for a variety of analytical methods, and they've also done quite a few gluten kits. I can tell you guys the 2 kits that have undergone this validation that are available for home use are the Easy Gluten and the Gluten Tox. They've both done a far more extensive validation than the NEMA has. The NEMA, just from the independent, there have been a couple of independent studies done, and I can give those to you, Lindsay, if you want to share them with anybody who wants them.
That'd be great.
They just have problems with both false positives and false negatives at a rate that's higher than we expect from the kits we have our manufacturers use. So fortunately, like I said, there's 2 of those methods our manufacturers use all the time. A lot of manufacturers use these gluten and the gluten tox. They're very good methods, and they're available for home purchase, and they don't require a $200 to $300 upfront device cost.
So Laura, could you actually tell me a little bit more, the approved tests you just talked about, like can you walk me through, okay, you have a product at home, you want to test it. How do you test it? Like, how is the product tested? And I know you mentioned it's not $200. What is the typical range of cost?
So for something like the Easy Gluten or the Gluten Tox, they're usually $10 to $12 a test strip. You might be limited. You might have to buy them in like a 5-pack or something at a time. So there is a bit of a financial investment up front, but it's not a device and then, strips each time. It's basically just for both kits, taking a sample of the product. Now, taking a sample of the product is in itself something we could talk about for the next 20 days. But what you guys want to focus on when you're taking a sample, you can go 1 of 2 ways. If you don't know the product at all and you're not sure where the gluten risk might be, you want to get a representative sample. So they might give you a little tiny scoop. The Easy Gluten, for instance, comes with a scoop. So fill that scoop in with little parts of each piece of that meal if you've never had it before and you don't know where the risk might be, in a ratio that's sort of representative of the meal as a whole. You can probably skip things like, if it's a steak, skip the steak itself. The meat itself isn't going to be a problem, but maybe the sauce on it is. So you might want to get some of that when you sample. If there's a bread or a roll on there, you might want to test that all by itself, because that's going to be a really high risk thing. If it's a pasta, if it's a pizza crust, obviously focus on the grain-based, breadier kind of items. But again, if it's some kind of hodgepodge meal and you've never had it, just try to get something that's representative. You're generally going to take that, put it in some little vial of solution, mix it up really good, and then you're going to take some of the drops of that liquid and maybe put them in another tube, put a test strip in, and wait 10 minutes for your result to develop. Easy to do at home, maybe a little awkward at a restaurant, but
yeah. No, but it's great to know. And why? So how are those a little different than the NEMA sensor?
It's not so much that it's different. I mean, the NEMA sensor is basically, so when you get the Easy Glutens, you get, I had a picture on one of my slides where it showed test strips with the various results. So the NEMA actually has that kind of a strip within the device, and then it's got a little optical reader. So it's just reading the strip for you that otherwise you would read with your eyes. So the technology is, as far as the antibody reaction and the gluten detection, is exactly the same. It just has some issues that, because of the way it's set up, go into too much detail, but it just has some issues that you won't run into with a loose strip on its own and with a new strip every time. So yeah, it's the same technology, kind of just a different format.
Well, I know we'll follow up with you, but I would love the list of the ones that you do recommend. And Lindsay,
I'll get the list and I'll send it out.
One final question for Laura.
I have a final question. Sure. Somebody is wondering if there is any penalty for a company that mislabels something and it goes out with people thinking it's gluten-free and it turns out it's not, or any kind of errors in that way. Is there a penalty or any, kind of price they pay for that error?
Well, there certainly is if it's a recall. Recalls are very costly, both financially and in consumer trust. And those are, published publicly. The FDA puts them out. Generally, you'll see on your TV if there's, I think that recent Vans recall made it on the news. That is a cost to them, and that they do lose consumer trust a little bit. Not to pick on Vans, they're not the only people who've ever had a recall. But so there's cost to people that way. There's no actual financial, penalties that the FDA imposes. For us, with our certification, if recalls repeat, we can withdraw certification. That's sort of our power in that. But yeah, through FDA, it's mostly the loss in product and the loss in consumer confidence that really affects the companies.
I think that's our last.
Yeah,
I think that's our last one.
This was amazing and such a good topic. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. I think we all have so much to learn. I think you dispelled a lot of myths and facts that go into it can be a confusing world with label reading and testing and just even manufacturing. So thank you. I feel educated. I feel like I'm walking away with a lot more information. I hope all of you are. I want to remind you that this will be placed on our YouTube channel in a few days, and Lindsay will be sending out Dr. Allred's presentation as well as other resources. So I just can't thank the team enough. And Dr. Allred, this was fantastic. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
It was fun. Great questions. And thank you for having me.
Awesome.
Thanks so much, Laura.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Allred. Fantastic.
It was awesome.